Thank you. As she said, my name's Tom Gibbs. I'm one of the research historians here at the museum. I work in the research department. Our main job is to travel the country and collect oral history interviews with the remaining World War II veterans and anybody having to do with the American experience during World War II. Today I'm here to talk to you guys about the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines. It's a little outside of my scope. I know nothing about oil production. I am not an engineer. So please keep the technical questions for Google when you get home. This has been called the greatest government private industry cooperation ever achieved. And I'm going to highlight why this is considered to be the greatest co-op project ever done in America. Definitely there's some other projects that compete, the building of the highway interstate system, but in terms of what needed to be done at the time and how quickly they accomplished it, I don't think anything holds a candle to this. Let's talk a little bit about background on oil production. The first successful oil pipeline, oil was first discovered in the United States at Oil Creek, Pennsylvania in 1859. The first successful commercial oil pipeline was in the ground, actually above ground, by 1865. It was 2 inches in diameter, and it was made of wrought iron and held together by screws. It was extremely leaky. It was the beginning of the oil industry. These people were really just trying to figure this out. Standard Oil was the main oil company that operated inside of Pennsylvania, and actually we saw some of our first court cases regarding monopolies in the United States tied with Standard Oil. They were a monopoly in Pennsylvania. Eventually a competitor came along, the Tidewater Pipeline Company in 1879, and they built the longest line up to date at that point of 115 miles, and it traversed some of the Allegheny Mountains. It was an incredible technological feat for the time, and never before had oil flowed over such great distance. People began to see the money in oil with this development in 1879 because they realized that if there was a cheaper way to transport the stuff, you could lower the prices for the consumer. And these pipelines by 1879, I think the biggest one was 5 inches. So they were very, very small in diameter. The next kind of big revolution, if you will, in the pipeline industry came in 1920 with the development of the 8-inch pipeline. This would be the size pipeline that would make up most of the infrastructure pre-World War II. An interesting thing to note, by the end of the 1920s, major refineries in the United States were producing 80,000 to 125,000 barrels of oil per day, but the pipeline technology and the shipping industry had clearly not caught up at this point. The pipeline industry was not able to keep up with that. Out of all the existing pipelines in the United States, you have 125,000 barrels being produced per day. The existing pipeline structure could only carry 20,000 barrels per day. So at this point, even in 1920, the production of oil is outweighing our capacity to ship it. People realize, as the auto industry starts booming, that oil is going to be a big player. It's not going anywhere. So we start trying to figure out how can we transport this stuff, how can we transport more of it. In 1930s, the Big Inch technology was more or less perfected. Big Inch pipelines refer to pipelines that have diameters greater than 12 inches. This is pretty substantial. People knew that this technology, this need for oil would evolve, but because of the Depression in the 1930s, because oil byproducts such as plastics hadn't been completely refined yet, or it was just in its infancy, there really wasn't that much of a demand for oil in the United States in the 1930s. If you were lucky enough to afford a car, which is a very small population, that's really all the people in the country that were using oil. By the 1930s, leading up to the war, 115,000 miles of pipeline had been excavated and put into place in the United States. The best technology available at the time was this 8-inch pipeline. Mostly this 115,000 miles was comprised of 8-inch pipeline. Some of that 115,000 miles even had 6-inch pipeline and 4-inch pipeline. So the capacity varied depending on which pump station you were getting the oil to, which section of line was bigger or smaller. This created headaches among people who were trying to figure out how to ship this stuff and ship it quick and effectively. Kind of tie this into World War II. American military planners in the 30s knew that if war was going to break out, that oil would be very, very important, obviously, to the entire effort. There were people who already were seeing what was going on in Europe. There were people who were seeing that what was going on in the Pacific, and some very smart people in the 30s realized that if we were to go to war, this issue of transporting oil was going to be hard. It was going to be something that our system would need a complete revamp. As I said before, leading up to the 30s, we were producing about 125,000 barrels of oil per day, but only had the capacity to ship 20,000 barrels of it. Leading up to World War II, the entire consumption of oil on the East Coast was 1.4 million barrels daily. And we only had the ability to ship via rail, tanker, 20,000 barrels per day, excuse me. A lot of numbers here, sorry, I'm not used to all these numbers. Once they started realizing that there was a need, these American planners got together, and I'm actually going to come back to how the American planners came together. But this was really the first thing that was foreseen with these guys in the 30s. They understood that 90% of all oil before the war was shipped to the East Coast via tanker. The other 10% was in your rail cars, your river barges, in that 115,000 miles of existing pipeline. So really the facilities depended on the tankers. We needed tankers for this oil effort to be successful. Jumping forward a little bit, this is a chart that shows merchant ship losses in the Atlantic starting in 1942 and ending in July of 42. You can see right here the Gulf of Mexico. Every last one of these black dots is a merchant ship sunk. These include tankers. You can see down here we were getting a lot of oil from Venezuela. That's another important thing I forgot to mention. America was producing 60% of the world's oil leading up to World War II. Russia was the next closest with 17%. British and Dutch companies dominated all of the oil-rich regions of the world. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan had little to no domestic crude oil ability and relied mostly on imports. Whoops. Sorry about that. And once war broke out, the British Navy blockaded all of the imports of German oil. Germany knew this was going to happen, and they actually had a large reserve of synthetic oil built up, basically fuel built off of coal byproducts. Really messy stuff. You just don't get the same punch out of it that you do with the high-octane refined stuff. So like I said before, 90% of the oil reached the East Coast via the Gulf Coast by oil tanker. And a very smart man by the name of Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes actually wrote a memo to Roosevelt in 1940 saying, building a pipeline will probably not be the most economically sound thing that we do, but in time of war it will become absolutely necessary. He saw in 1940, well before these U-boats started destroying our ships, that shipping oil from the oil fields in Texas to the East Coast where it needed to be to supply our fighting men was going to become untenable because of the U-boat threat. And like I said, 90% of that oil reached by tanker. On December 11th, 1941, Joachim von Ribbentrop announced that a state of war existed between the United States of America. He gave a man named Admiral Karl Dönitz basically free rein to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare against American interests. On the American side, a poor guy by the name of Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews was charged with protecting the East Coast, a job that was literally impossible at the time given the resources that we had. He had about 20 ships at his disposal, all woefully inadequately armed to protect 1,500 miles of American coastline. Most destroyers were tabbed for convoy and escort duty for the Lend-Lease program, so those ships were out as a viable option to protect these tankers. Oil companies threw out all sorts of suggestions. We should arm the tankers, we should train our crews, all of this stuff. But as we see later with the Battle of the Atlantic, really the only way they could have won it was by strict convoy duty, not just arming civilians on oil tankers. Operation Drumbeat was the name of the U-boat offensive waged against American shipping. And right after December 7th and right before the calendar changed to 1942, Dönitz sent 5 submarines, 5 U-boats to the east coast of the United States. He had requested 12, but he had only gotten 5. And to prove how effective these U-boats were, these 5 U-boats accounted for 73 ships sunk. They were responsible for the sinking of 200,000 tons of shipping. According to historian Edwin Hoyt, the effort made by these 5 submarines alone cost the Allies 400 tanks, 60 8-inch howitzers, 402-pound guns, 240 armored cars, 500 Bren carriers, 52,000 tons of ammunition, 6,000 rifles, 4,280 tons of tank supplies, 20,000 tons of stores, and 10,000 tanks of gasoline, all sunk to the bottom courtesy of 5 submarines. If that doesn't paint how perilous the predicament was in the Gulf and along the East Coast, I don't know what does. So what was America's answer? Or excuse me, better yet, the results of all of this U-boat treachery going on off our shores. Daily crude shipments, like I mentioned before, to supply the East Coast had reached 1.4 million barrels daily before the war. By 1943, tankers were only accounting for 100,000 barrels shipped per day. That means because of the U-boats, the efforts of the tankers were reduced 90% from their pre-war capacity. So what was America's answer? Figure it out. That's the best I can say it. Some very smart people were tasked with just figuring this whole mess, this supply and demand side of the war out. I mentioned Harold Ickes writing Roosevelt in 1940 saying that the situation will become untenable. Well, on May 27, 1941, Roosevelt declared the existence of an unlimited national emergency and called on citizens and private industry to make their own all-out efforts for national defense. On May 28th, the next day, Roosevelt appointed Harold Ickes as Petroleum Coordinator for National Defense. Ickes was the country's oil czar. He was the guy in charge of it all. They gave pretty much free rein to him to figure out the numbers, figure out how much gas we can give civilians for their average day, which I believe was 3 gallons a week, I think is what civilians got during the war. So he had to figure out, he had to balance the needs of civilian people in the United States, of civilians, and he had to balance the needs of what private industry and what the government needed to wage war on 2 fronts on either side of the world. Not an easy task by any means. I mentioned before that by 1943, only 10% of pre-war production was reaching East Coast refineries via tanker because of the U-boat problem. One of the things that they came up with as a way to solve this, and Lauren kind of hinted on this talking about her railroad lecture, was the cooperation that occurred while the pipelines were being built to get the oil we needed to invade North Africa, to get the oil that we needed to invade Taro in the Pacific. It's of due note that Japanese submarines in the Pacific did not go after tankers. They did not go after our supply ships. They were mainly going after the big guys. They wanted our cruisers, our aircraft carriers, our destroyers. There's many instances where Japanese submarines simply passed up a juicy-looking convoy just because they were carrying stuff and not men to kill them. Excuse me. I mentioned that rail production made up about maybe 5%, I think 5,000 barrels per day in 1941 were being shipped via rail to the East Coast. By 1943, 1 million barrels were being shipped by rail. They went from shipping 5,000 barrels to 1 million barrels by 1943 to keep up with our wartime demand. That is, I can't even do the math, that is just an exponential increase. IC's organization, the Petroleum Administration for War, eventually, it became the Petroleum Administration for War, and part of their main goal was allocating this resource on the rail, but it still wasn't enough oil. The rail production was only able to account for the pre-war civilian demand. They needed military demand. So really, the first time these people got together with the idea of building a pipeline, they met in, make sure I get the date correct here. They met in 1942, and they had a meeting, and this was called the Tulsa Plan. And this was basically 11 oil companies went in on this endeavor. I think 82 private contractors and about 16,000 men actually built the pipeline. But it was all set into motion during the Tulsa Plan meeting. It called for building a 24-inch diameter pipeline that could send 300,000 barrels of oil per day from East Texas to Illinois. In Illinois, it would be refined and then shipped. Let me go to my map here. Down here at the Gulf Coast, you have your oil refineries and you have some crude production. Here in Longview, you have your crude oil coming out of the ground in Texas. The first part of the plan called for building a pipeline from Longview to Norris City, Illinois. This is about 750 miles long right here, and its sole intent for the Big Inch pipeline was to get crude product to the refineries there in Illinois. Once in Illinois, the second phase of the project called for about 1,000 miles of pipeline to be built from Norris City all the way up here to Linden, New Jersey. In Linden, New Jersey, there would be 2 pipelines that branched off that would go to ports in Philadelphia and New York City. The Little Big Inch pipeline was the pipeline that carried refined products. This was product that was good to go, ready to use. And this would come from the refineries in the Gulf. The Little Inch would come up here, join with the Big Inch pipeline near Little Rock, Arkansas. And then from Little Rock, it would go to Norris, where the refined product would bypass the refineries, but the unrefined product would go into the refineries in Illinois. And then from there, all the way on to Linden, New Jersey, where it would be delved off into 2 different lines and allocated as necessary. It's important to note that the idea of a pipeline had been proposed before the war, but these oil companies were vehemently against it. They did not want government interference. These were your wealthy elite class who were probably already pretty perturbed with Roosevelt over the New Deal. These people did not want to have much cooperation with the United States government. However, that all changed once Pearl Harbor was attacked. The patriotism shown by these private companies is unbelievable to me. 11 oil companies got together, and I have the list who built the pipeline. They formed their own company, the War Emergency Pipelines Incorporated. It was a nonprofit. The government did mandate that they would make no money off of this. These pipelines would actually serve oil companies after the war, and they would make significant profit off of these after the war. But you can see here some of these famous companies: Standard Oil, Gulf, Consolidated, Shell, the Atlantic Refining Company, Tidewater Associated Oil Company, the Sun Oil Company, Pan American Petroleum and Transportation Company. On August 3rd, 1942 was when the first section of pipeline was laid. I want to go back to my map here. The first section was laid in August of 1942 in Longview, Texas. By New Year's Eve of 1942, They had oil flowing to Norris City, Illinois. To Norris City, Illinois. From August of 42 to the end of the year, they laid 750 miles of pipeline. That is unheard of. I wanted to confirm this, but I couldn't. I believe that's still a record for the fastest a pipeline has ever been laid down. So August 3rd, 1942, these 11 stockholding companies get together. They figure it out. I have some numbers that I'm going to show you guys later because I can't quite tell all this without throwing the numbers up on the screen because they're really going to give you guys an idea truly how impressive this whole cooperative was. By July of 1943, 350 days after the first section of pipeline was built, oil began to flow from Longview, from Beaumont, all the way to Linden, New Jersey. They built roughly 1,400 miles of pipeline in less than a year, in 350 days. And the only way I can really talk about how impressive this is just by giving you guys some of the sheer numbers. $95 million to build. I did a quick calculator today on Google. If you can type in $1 million, and it'll tell you how much it's worth today. $1 million in 1943. $95 million was all taxpayer funded, and today this would equate to almost $1 billion. 350 days complete, like I said, 1,400 miles long. It went under railroads at 289 points, under highways at 626 points. I mentioned there were two pipelines, one for the refined product, one for the unrefined product. This is another interesting part. 3,800 miles of pipeline from that existing pre-war structure of 115,000 miles was repositioned. Parts were scrapped. People just took it. The pumps, the meters, some of the sections of pipes. This stuff was just taken, literally just requisitioned by the government and thrown into the mix for supplies for the building of these pipelines. It had 33 river crossings, and it went under 200 creeks and lakes. The biggest river that it crossed was the Mississippi River. And actually, they had a little bit of a problem getting it under the Mississippi. I didn't know this, but oil pipelines are extremely heavy, and when empty, they will float. So when you build these things, you have to get them under the water and put these gigantic clamps on them that weigh like, I think, 5,000 pounds a clamp, and that holds it to the ground. There was a big storm, and essentially their progress was lost, and I think it delayed the project 2 days, but they were able to get what they needed to get that thing under the Mississippi. 3,140,000 cubic yards of earth were moved. This pipeline traverses 95 counties through 10 states. On either side of the pipeline, there was a 75-foot right-of-way space, if you will, 75 yards on either side. 7,500 individual right-of-way grants and tenant consent was procured. That's a pretty remarkable thing, and when the government knocks at your door saying, we're going to pay you for your land, we need you to do this to help save your country, I'm sure they had no problems at all at that time. Pumping stations were laid out every 50 miles to keep the oil flowing at a desired rate. I mentioned earlier there were 82 construction contractors, various people. They had to build houses along the pipeline so that these men could sleep. You see actually some of the first suburban type looking subdivisions in America sprouting up along these pipelines, and I don't know if there's anything to it, I'm just throwing it out there, but they look a lot like the suburbs you see in the 1950s booming across America, so maybe people got their idea from this, but they look like pictures from the 1950s. It's quite remarkable. Very nice houses. 21,185 rail cars loaded with pipe had to be positioned and brought in along different rail routes that would be advantageous to the section being built at that time. 135,700 tons of pipe were from that station in Longview, Texas to Norris City, Illinois. Once it got to Illinois, where I mentioned the product was refined, it would be moved to New Jersey. That pipeline required another 225,000 tons of steel. The initial contract called for 5 miles of pipeline to be laid per day, but these guys were motivated. You have to remember, a lot of these workers were given special exemptions from joining the service because of their expertise. This was how these people were serving their country, so they beefed it up to 9 miles a day. They were really working hard. One individual section of pipe would be about 38 to 44 feet long and weigh roughly 3,800 pounds. I mentioned that the number they were shooting for when all this was said and done would be 300,000 barrels of oil per day. On April 1st, 1945, I have some statistics here. By April 1st, 1945, 185,122,264 barrels were pumped through 2 lines after the first year it was open. That's how many barrels went through in that first year. Of that number, if you divvied up by day, you were looking at roughly 308,099 barrels per day. And pre-war, they were shooting, or when the project started, they were shooting for 300,000 barrels a day. So they were exceeding that. The Little Inch pipeline, which carried your refined products, carried 72,666,098 barrels through the line in the first year, and that came out to 199,000 barrels of refined product per day. 250,000 horsepower was spread out along the lines to pump the oil. You had to keep this stuff flowing. 121 million kilowatt hours per month was how much electricity this thing consumed. The first year of operation, it used roughly 1.28 billion kilowatts per hour, making it the single largest consumer of electricity in the United States at the time. 0.7 cents per kilowatt per hour comes out to $9 million per year to keep this thing juiced up. And I think one of the most telling statistics and why this is so important, and you know, this is such an underestimated part of the history, between 1941 and 1945, the Axis produced 276 million barrels of oil. Between 41 and 45, 500 million came from Texas alone. And that is a heck of a stat. We were supplementing some of our oil supply, like I said, through Venezuela, and through some of the other oil-rich regions in the Gulf. But this really, in my opinion, helps illustrate how we won the war. We couldn't have juiced up all these tanks. We couldn't have flown these planes. I was talking to my boss earlier. We were saying it's roughly 2 million barrels, 2 million gallons of gasoline were needed to put 1,000 planes over Germany for bombing raids. And I'm sure there are some other amazing statistics about how many barrels of oil for a column of tanks and things of that nature. But pretty much everything was relying on oil. This was mechanized warfare. This was the result of what we saw at the beginning of World War I. And really, this kind of ushered America into the age of oil prosperity, and you know, once we started figuring out that we could derive plastics from this stuff, these pipelines only became more valuable later on. The legacy. In 1947, they sold the Big Inch pipelines to Texas Eastern Transmission Company. It was the largest sale of war surplus made to the private sector by the United States government. This company, Texas Eastern Transmission, in reality, Texas was actually almost bled dry from the available oil reserves. They would obviously go on to discover more oil there. But at that point, gas was hard to come by in Texas, but there was tons of natural gas. So this Texas Eastern Transmission Company basically reconverted the lines to natural gas transmission. And that's how they made a lot of money from 1948 on. These lines carried natural gas to the East Coast, and they still carry natural gas to this day. The Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines are on the National Register of Historic Landmarks. But I think the most important thing in all of this, it highlights the ability of people to get along. It really shows that in a time of struggle, America was willing to come together. America was willing to do whatever needed to be done to get the job done. This was no easy task, as you saw by those statistics. A lot of moving parts, a lot of things had to take place for this to happen. And really the American people bought into it very well. Actually, the Office of War Information put out a propaganda video, which I'm going to show here in a second, talking about pipelines, talking about why is it important that you only get 3 gallons of gas as a civilian at this point in the war. But without a doubt, I can sit here and say with assured confidence that we would not have won the war if it was not for this oil production. If we didn't have the means to get this oil, you wouldn't have these massive armies traversing oceans and fighting battles thousands of miles away. That's pretty much all I have for the talk right now. I'd love to take some questions really quickly before we get to the video, and you don't have to stick around. It's just a neat little piece of history.
Did you mention how the diameter of the pipes?
Yes. Sorry, the Big Inch pipelines were 12-inch diameter. They were originally shooting for 24, but they couldn't get it, but 12 was what they settled on. Yep.
The Big Inch and the Little Inch, do they run side by side?
They run separate at Longview, and that's the Big Inch from here, and that's the Little Big Inch, and they're separated until they get to Little Rock, Arkansas. Once they get to Little Rock, they're pretty much joined and running side by side.
Were they enough refineries? Did they have to build refineries?
Well, of course, they had to build refineries just because the demand was jumping up. But that's why the Little Big Inch was put in Beaumont, because that's where most of the refinery capability existed. And they actually did have to build refineries in Norris City to handle all this oil that was coming in through the pipeline.
The terms Big Inch and Little Big Inch, is that just referring to the size? Or?
Yes, Big Inch is just the size of the pipe, and they called it the Little Big Inch just because it transported less oil, and more oil flowed through the Big Inch pipeline than the Little Big Inch. But Big Inch, if you type it in, Big Inch is, I guess, just an industry term for size of a pipe, I guess. But yeah. Any more questions? If you want to stick around, I have this video that's fairly neat. I found it interesting. And it just gives you the history, the basic history of why this needed to be done at the time. I apologize for the quality.
There was oil in Texas, huge reservoirs of it, under the land. Thousands of miles away, the United Nations were opening their offensives against tyranny. Each step, each campaign increasing the need for oil. Most of the oil for the machines of war had to be brought by seagoing tanker to the refineries on the Atlantic coast, nearly 2,000 miles from Texas to New Jersey. America's tanker fleet was stretched thin, carrying oil to Africa, to Britain, to Australia, and the Pacific Islands. The railroads were reorganized to multiply their capacity. Vast freights composed solely of tank cars rolled deliveries through on the first priority. Oil was even packed in drums for shipment in boxcars. It was not enough. The answer was a pipeline, the longest ever built and in the least possible time. From Texas across the broad states of Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania to New Jersey. 1,388 miles, greater than the distance between London and Leningrad. Surveying planes took to the air. They mapped the route across half America, across hill and mountain, through forest and swamp, across 30 rivers and 7 states. The work began. The pipeliners moved against the land. 44 crews, one working in the rich loam of the Indiana farmland, another through the scrub pines of Arkansas, another in the broad valleys of the Ohio. They dug a ditch 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep and 1,400 miles long. The railroads moved the pipe in. 1/8 of a mile of it on every flat car, moved it fast to strategic points along the right-of-way, while the pipeliners used 50 carloads a day. The Caterpillar tractors walked the 2-ton pieces into the firing line. More than 180,000 joints of pipe. A team of men working together, each with a skill and respect for the other's skill. Joint by joint, weld by weld, fused into a solid tube. In 7 states, day after day, the welding torches flared against the steel. The pipeliners affectionately named the line Big Inch. Then, while tractors cradled the big fellow, it was spot cleaned to rid it of grease and oil, scoured with brush and scalers to remove flux and rust, and the priming machine spread a protective coat of coal tar compound. The wrapping machine followed close behind. Tough asbestos felt spiraled around Big Inch to guard against distortion and soil stress. One day, the Pennsylvania crew started uphill. The ditching slowed, and the engineers came into the field again. Ahead lay the Alleghenies, mountain ranges which had pinned the colonial Americans against the seaboard for 150 years. Now to be conquered in a different kind of pioneering, and from the opposite direction. Rock fought back, and spring floods, and mud. Then they faced the icy Susquehanna River and a ditch to be blasted from the rock bottom. 400,000 pounds of dynamite was carefully planted. They stood on the bank and waited. that remained was to bury Big Inch. And along the line, the earth went back. Drag lines and throw buckets rolled the backfill over, put the baby to bed, covered her with earth. "26 pumping stations, 50 miles apart, stood ready to drive the oil through. And 300,000 additional barrels of oil was added every day to the seaboard stockpile. Oil has set the pace of this war. Oil must see it through. Oil from Texas, carried by Big Inch to the ships and armies of the United Nations.
So you can see very clearly this is a massive undertaking, and I was glad to be able to share this with you guys today. So thank you for coming out.